Welcome you to the next installment of our Empire Lecture Series. My name is Hans Knoll at Georgetown University, and our speakers are Chris Achen and Larry Bartels, who will be talking to us about democracy for realists. I've known Chris and Larry for a long time, and I'm not going to tell you how great they are, because you don't need me to tell you that, or all of the wonderful nice things that they've done for me. But I do know that they've been working on this project off and on for a long time, and the brief time I spent at Princeton, I think they were teaching a class on democratic theory. The students called democratic theory from A to B. It sounds like, though, they've gotten through the rest of the alphabet, so that this will be good, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest about that. So the topic is democracy for realists. They're arguing that we have a romantic folk theory about democracy that's misled both scholars and citizens about the realities and the potential of democratic government. Democracy has important benefits, but self-government is not among them. That's, I think, a provocative claim. It's one I'm inclined to agree with, but it is definitely provocative, so why don't we let Chris and Larry try to convince us. So, please.
Thanks very much, Hans. Larry has made me present, but that means he'll be available for questions at the end for the more serious objections and so on, so there'll be a chance to hear from us both. The first thing I want to say, Hans has mentioned, which is that due to a typographical error, which we discovered rather late, our topic of democracy for realists got transmuted in the bulletin into democracy for results. So those of you who've come for results can leave now. This is going to be about something else. Well, we have a book in review now at Princeton Press. We've gotten one review back from one person, and the others are due momentarily. And in the manner of these things, were due a month ago, but they're not really late yet. In the manner of, so we hope it'll be out next year. In the manner of new authors, we would, of course, like to take you through each footnote in loving detail. That's exactly how authors feel, that they're all precious and we spent so much time on them and so on. We're no exception to that, but the fact that the book has taken a decade means that there's an even larger number of footnotes than usual, but today we have just 30 minutes. So we thought what we would do is try to give you not just an overview of what it is that we're writing about, but also a sense of how we have felt as the work progressed. So we started with the idea that after 50 years of empirical research, democratic theory had some serious challenges. I was teaching a course of that kind, so was Larry. Unbeknownst to either of us, he wrote a paper, an important paper called Democracy with Attitudes, that I read in draft, and I wrote him a note and said, much to my surprise, we're thinking about this exactly the same way. He said, why don't you come visit for several days and we'll talk this through until we find where we're not in agreement. I got back on the plane after the end of those 3 or 4 days. We hadn't found any place where we were in disagreement, and so we foolishly agreed to write a book together. So we began thinking that, yes, there were serious difficulties, but somewhere in the corpus of democratic theory, it was, of course, very large. It would be easy to fill this room with work that's been written on democratic theory and still have plenty of books and articles left over. Somewhere in there, we thought, was a point of view that would cope with the problems that democratic theory, in our view, faces after the last 50 years of work. We are both, if you trace our dissertation advisors back, we're both descended academically, intellectually from Austin Ranney, and I at least began with the idea that the doctrine of responsible party government might be the answer to the challenges we were seeing. But it turned out that on close inspection, the empirical work of the last half century had killed that idea. It was dead, even though one still saw it walking around in journal articles and books as if it were alive. But there wasn't any life remaining in it. It was walking, but it was dead. It was a zombie. And the more we looked, the more dead ideas we found, all of them walking around, but not actually alive. And I'll talk about some of those as we go through here. They're all zombies. And every idea that we could think of about democratic theory turned out to be a zombie. And we found ourselves in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. So let me walk you through a little bit of what it was we were, the path we've gone down. And of necessity, this will be pretty summary in this context, and without too much in the way of actual empirical results. But we're glad to talk about those in the question and answer period for those of you who are interested. We began partly by thinking about divine right of kings. And, you know, we have forgotten that when this idea was popular not so many centuries ago, professors of the equivalent of professors of political science at that time were unanimously enthusiastic about this idea and taught their students that this was the right way to think about the world. And those people in turn taught further students and so on. The idea that anyone would take democracy seriously was a non-starter certainly as late as the 17th century and well into the 18th. So, you know, there was a lot of self-congratulation in this period that they had arrived at the best possible form of government. And responsible people defended that doctrine. If you didn't, if you wandered off in one direction or another, people got worried about your judgment and good sense and even your moral values. And of course there were problems with governments in that period, as there always have been, worse in many ways then than now. And the question was, if the king was really appointed by God, how could those horrible disasters have occurred? And the notion was that the king was never wrong, although sometimes badly advised. So that notion and its intellectual power, century after century, seemed to us to have an analog. And the analog is this one, that, as Bob Dahl put it, popular sovereignty requires that whenever policy choices are perceived to exist and so on and so forth, that individual people, the members of the political community, should be the people making those choices. Now, nobody disputes that in this era, right? It's beyond criticism among responsible intellectuals. We teach it to our students, they are going to teach it to their students, and so on down the line. And when you disagree with it, again, questions arise as to your good judgment and perhaps even your moral sense. We even have a doctrine about how this could possibly be happening given how many mistakes get made, and the answer is exactly parallel to the notion of the king's two bodies that was popular in the divine right of kings era, and it is precisely what Rousseau said, the people are never corrupted but sometimes deceived. So the parallels are pretty remarkable, and the result of this is a kind of folk theory, what we call a folk theory of democracy. People have ideas about policy, they elect people to carry those out, and the government then carries out those ideas. This is what we were all taught in high school. We know that it's too simple, but in fact and it's been criticized for more than a century, famously Converse in '64, but a lot of capable people before him said exactly the same thing. And we know it doesn't work, but that just doesn't keep us from saying the same thing over and over again. This one is projected a little bit poorly, but the upper graph there is, these are ideas about how the government was handling the federal deficit in the Clinton administration over that as of '96. This is data from the ANES in that year. The upper graph is, the middle of this is the deficits neither getting, the middle on the vertical axis is the deficits neither getting better nor worse. And as you go to the top, the deficit's getting better, and as you go to the bottom, the deficit's getting worse. the deficit was, of course, improving by leaps and bounds in that era. It was one of the achievements of the Clinton administration was to get the deficit under control. The upper graph is Democrats, and the horizontal axis here is knowledge by percentile. So the middle point is the 50th percentile in political information, and as you go to the right, you get people who know more. As you see from the upper graph, even well into the distribution of information for Democrats, they had no idea what was happening to the deficit. It is only toward the upper third of the information distribution that you start to get Democrats recognizing that their own guy has improved the deficit dramatically. For Republicans, even at the upper end, there's only a little recognition and concession that no good Clinton had actually improved the deficit. And in the middle ranges, the opinion is actually most common that he had made the deficit worse. So this is a purely factual matter discussed very widely in the media at the time, on which the average citizen simply wasn't very clear about what was happening. And only at the upper end do you get some recognition of what the truth of the matter is. This is a kind of central question you'd want to know the answer to for the folk theory of democracy to be working. People have some judgment about how things are going, but that's just not something people can do. We have a chapter about this. We model this with Bayesian setup and show that you can predict these somewhat odd-looking lines pretty well and so on. But the central point for our purposes is A, people don't know the facts. B, they use their partisanship to make a decision about what the correct version of the facts is. So the folk theory of democracy simply doesn't work, and we go on about that at some length. Everybody knows those data. What we're really not willing to do most of the time is face bluntly the consequences of that for democratic theory. A more sophisticated defense of democracy is the retrospective voting literature. So people don't know the policy issues, but they can tell good outcomes from bad, and so they can pick a government the same way you pick a dentist. You have toothache, you go to the dentist. If it gets better, you figure you've got a good dentist and you return the following time. And if your toothache doesn't get better, you go to a different dentist. So that's the logic of that. This view goes back a long time, actually. You can find 19th century observers of American politics who talked about this. John Jackson started to write about it. Mo Fiorina made up the word retrospective and wrote about it at length, popularized the ideas, and there is his version of how retrospection works. So among academics, this is a more popular version of how democracy might work. It's driving your car by looking in the rearview mirror. And it works about as well, we argue, as that would work on the highways. So I'm so sorry about the graphics here. They're just not working very well. The fact is that this is, in fact, what people do. So the plot here is a partial regression plot. We've taken out the effect of time in office, so people just get tired of the Democrats when they've been in office for 2 or 3 or 4 terms. They get tired of the Republicans in the same way. We've taken out that effect. And the plot here, the 1,000 points of light, I guess, are individual elections here. And what's on the horizontal axis is the rate of change of the growth rate, that is, of GDP per capita, disposable income in this case. And what's on the vertical axis is the vote for the incumbents. And as you can see, you get a spectacular linear fit. So to a good approximation, what happens in elections is that people, in fact, do retrospection, mostly about the state of the economy, and that plus the balance in the American population between Democrats and Republicans, that cancels out. And what determines election outcomes is precisely this kind of retrospective voting. The problem is, as James Buchanan said when he got hammered in the 1858 midterm elections by the Republicans, we have about as much to do with the economy as with the motions of a comet. And that's still the issue now. If administrations could make the economy do exactly what they wanted to, they would. But they can't. And so the result is a kind of musical chairs, we argue. In addition, there's the difficulty that the voters often wrongly attribute blame. So some of you may already have heard about our study of shark attacks during the Woodrow Wilson administration in summer of 1916. Again, the arrows here, I'm sorry that so much of the graphics are being lost here, but these two shark attacks took place, and first one in Beach Haven, which is about 2/3 of the way down the coast there, and the next one a little farther north, and Princeton's not too far away. Some people think that the sharks were after the inhabitants of Princeton, but just couldn't quite get close enough. I don't know. But in any case, we show that those shark attacks and the handful of people who died in those reduced the vote for Wilson along the shore by an amount almost as large as the Depression reduced the vote for Herbert Hoover. So it goes without saying that the administration didn't control the sharks. The administration was very aggressive about trying to do absolutely everything that they could. Some people say, well, the complaint was really that what was not done for them afterwards, it's impossible to know what they could have done that they weren't doing. That voters punished anyway. So the first part of the problem is that the voters punish for things the government has no control over. And we estimate, for example, that almost 3 million people voted against Al Gore in 2000 because it rained too little or too much in their state. So this stuff has real consequences. He would have been president with slightly better weather. One possibility now is that there's an additional difficulty here, which is the myopia in voter retrospections. Larry has written about this, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now, but there's the additional problem that people just look at the last year. They don't look at the times before that. So if you are incredibly nasty and incompetent for 3 years, and then the economy comes around in the 4th year, people are delighted, even if they're worse off on net than they were when you took office. And by contrast, if you're great to them for 3 years and then there's a little recession in your fourth term, even if you're better off than you were when they took office, they vote you out. So there's two kinds of irrationality. One is the myopia, and the other is the inability to attribute to the right people. Might this somehow be rational anyway? People threw Herbert Hoover out during the Depression. Maybe that was a vote for a better government. But we find that that's not the case. That what was going on in the Roosevelt period is exactly the same kind of myopic retrospection that you see in later periods. Oh, I'm so sorry. But going on in the Roosevelt period is exactly the same kind of myopic retrospection that you see in later periods. Oh, I'm so sorry about the graphs, but anyway, this is the same kind of graph for the Depression period. This is the change in the vote from 32 to 36 on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis here is the change in the income per capita, disposable income per capita by state in this period. One thing about this period is that there are gigantic changes particularly in the agricultural states, in income per capita. So you don't need a microscope to see the effects. Same thing. So there's a huge literature on the ideological judgments people made in 1936 and how the New Deal slowed down in later years because people wanted to put the ideological brakes on and so on and so forth. We find that myopic economic retrospection is a much better predictor. Again, the vertical lines are lost here, but this is 2008 and the lead for McCain, which in the fall of 2008, as you remember, a variety of news items start to happen which make it clear that a substantial recession is coming, and various financial institutions are going under and so forth, and the vote shares turn around in that period in exactly the way that you'd expect. What about in, oh, I'm so sorry, but anyway, what about in places where there were socialists in power? The upper line here is the number of seats, the red stuff. The blue below that is the number of, is the vote share. And this is for the Canadian province of Alberta in this same period. And why are we looking at that? Because there were socialists. There was a socialist party in power. They took power at the first time of the first arrow there when there was a recession around in the early 20s. And they were in power when the recession, when the Depression hit. So on the logic that people should vote for the left-wing party when times are hard and the right-wing party when times are good, just because they don't want to have to pay taxes, in other words, that the voters are engaged in ideological thinking, you would expect that a socialist party would increase its vote if the Depression hit. Precisely the opposite's true. They plunge. And in fact, they plunge so badly that they are wiped out as a party in Alberta. By contrast, this is the same, again, I'm sorry the labeling is gone here. This is the same thing for the Social Credit Party, which is a funny money, quasi-right-wing nut party, which was the alternative in the Depression era in Alberta. And they come from nowhere and become not just the winners at that period, but the long-term majority governing party in the state. And again, the ideology is a very difficult explanation here. It's just that they were, the socialists were the bums got thrown out, they were replaced by somebody else, and they were in power for decades. So the effects of myopic retrospection are not only important for the current election, but they get incorporated into partisanship and they last for decades. So all of this means that that the way we think about democracy, the idea that elections are in some sense a referendum, that's a zombie. The idea that the winners of an election have a mandate, that's a zombie. The idea that what's going on in these cases is that the ideas of the populace are being turned into policy and the voters are choosing who to put into power on the basis of their policies, that's a zombie too. So if this is as bad as we say, we ought to be able to see some concrete for instances of it. Again, I'm sorry all the labeling is being wiped out here by this laptop, but this is the percent of mayors who support fluoridation. And the three bars here are, starting at the left, mayors with one-year terms. In the middle are mayors with 2 to 4 year terms, and on the right are mayors with greater term in office. And this is data from the great fluoridation battles mostly in the 50s, some extent in the 60s. And these are, so the mayors on the left are those with short-term electoral problems. They have to respond to voter preferences. The ones on the right are much less so. The height of the bar is the probability that those mayors will support fluoridation. So you can see that when you have real populist short terms and real populist control over mayors, what happens is that you get this kind of an effect. People in a populist theory of democracy harm their children. So, sorry, if I can get this to go where I want it to go. I'm going to skip this part because I'm running out of time. What we want to argue in the last part of this book is that democracy is mostly not about the voters and their policy choices. It's about groups. And in particular, it's about groups and group identities, not about the issue positions voters have. This is an old argument in many ways. It stems from the conflict theorists in European sociology in the 19th century, but of course it's been extended and enhanced a great deal. And there's a lot of evidence that policy isn't crucial, it's identity. So the height here, again, these graphs are being destroyed, but anyway, the heights of these purple bars here are the percentage of Catholics voting for the Democrats from the ANES starting in 1952 and going to 2008. And there's only one big bar there. Catholics have favored the Democrats throughout this period, a little less in recent years than in earlier ones, but there's only one big bar. And that big bar occurs, of course, in 1960 when a Catholic ran for office. Policy doesn't explain it. Identity does. Now you might say, well, okay, fine, Chris, this is pleasant talk, but not the realignment in the South, right? Not white Southerners. That was about racial ideas, and that's where that has come from. Again, you can't see this very well, but these two lines here are the gap in partisan voting by two kinds of Southern whites. One group of Southern whites are those who favored school integration. The other group, larger group is those who were opposed to school integration. And again, it's the period from the 1960s through the early 2000s. And you can see that they're both becoming Republican and at almost exactly the same rate. It's not ideas, it's their identity as Southerners that's driving this. The Democratic Party is just not where they belong anymore. This is going to be really impossible to read. I think I'll skip it in the interest of time. What those two plots show is that when women have a conflict, this is from the Jennings-Nemi-Stoker data set, the only longitudinal survey we have in political science. When women find themselves with abortion attitudes that conflict with the position of their party, disproportionately, they change their political party. When men find themselves with abortion attitudes out of whack with their party, disproportionately, they just change their abortion attitudes to match their party. So identity is mattering in those two cases. Partisanship is the more powerful identity for men because the abortion thing doesn't matter as much to them, and the opposite is true for women. So for most people, partisanship is not a carrier of ideology. This is where we depart from the responsible doctrine of responsible party government. But partisanship predicts, and so does race. And the voters don't always get those choices right, but they get them right more often than they would if they were voting on the issues, which are pretty tough to understand. So people have a partisanship. Better informed people have a partisanship. And for better informed people, the people that Converse talked about in a very favorable way, that's us and you. What are those people doing? They're taking cues from their party. So we've got two classes of people, essentially, in the population, and to stereotype them both a little bit. There's the bulk of the population, which isn't paying attention, and those are, in many respects, the dodos in the population. Then there's the other group that is paying attention, and they're the parrots, right? They are taking advice, the parrot birds. They're taking advice from their party. From the viewpoint of traditional democratic theory, the folk theory of democracy, both of these sets of people, meaning the whole population, including those of us in this room, are bird brains, right? So it can't possibly be the way to think about democratic theory, and we want to propose a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. Spatial theory of voting is a good example of a zombie, and we talk about that. Now, the Federalist Papers are actually quite different on this whole subject. And what we want to argue is that thinking about it in that way, as opposed to the cliches about, you know, the only cure for democracy is more democracy, or proportional representation is more democratic, and turning things over to the population and referendums is more democratic. We argue that all of those are zombies. So representation can't be about issue congruence. It can't be about looking at the policy positions of representatives and comparing those to the policy positions of their constituents. Larry and I have both done work of that kind, and we now regard it as purely descriptive, not causal. Democracy is instead about other things. It's about freedom to organize, which the Chinese understand better than we do, and we think that political science needs to rethink pretty substantially. So, for example, the Downs model, which we're still inflicting on undergraduates in a lot of cases, we think that we ought to start teaching that as how you go wrong when you have a high school theory of how elections work. So we think this is about groups. We think this is about national groups, about party ideologies and how the parties structure this kind of thing. Our chair here today and others have written about that in a distinguished sort of way. We follow them. But the fundamental point we want to make here is that the folk theory of democracy, which we know is in trouble, but which we still keep falling back into in a lot of ways, is in exactly the same status now as the divine right of kings is when people figured out that that really wasn't going to work anymore. So we don't have a complete answer to what a new theory of democracy ought to look like. These notions about groups and parties and their ideologies seems to us where we need to go in a deeper and more serious way and stop worrying in great detail about the policy positions of individual voters. We think that's a mistake. But what is, regardless of how right we are about that, what is clear, we think, is that a fundamental rethinking of democratic theory is in order, and that we ought to stop telling the undergraduates about the divine right of the people to rule. All right, we welcome your suggestions and comments.
So if democracy is about groups, which I buy, so I was a student of theirs, so I'm on board. But how do we know which groups matter? And is it that there's some underlying groups that matter because they matter, or are elites able to manipulate the groups that matter? And are we normatively concerned about that?
No, it's yours.
I think both things are going on. There are some.
Can you go to the microphone, please?
Microphone to us. I think both things are going on. There are certainly some groups that are more likely, just in an inherent sense, given the nature of social life, to be important in shaping people's views and their interactions with each other. But at the margin, there's certainly a lot of effort by political elites to structure, manufacture, exploit people's group identities to their political advantage. And I think the relative effect of those two kinds of variations probably is different in different times and different places, but certainly worth studying in a more systematic way than we have.
Hi. The only thing more dour than the conclusions of this talk were the color of those slides. I'm going to be sad on the flight home, which I have to catch in just about a little while. So apologies if I have to leave early. My thinking in light of this is that political science has been become accustomed to using the word democracy when in fact, sort of revisiting the Federalist Papers, what we essentially have is a mixed regime republic, with various constraints, and in which the mixed regime is not simply dominated by the electorate of the different offices, but the time horizon of the different offices. Everything from life tenure for judges, if you want to think about the administrative state as having a similar kind of issue, longer terms for senators, shorter terms, slightly shorter for presidents than the House, and so forth. And when I think about the longer-term performance of a democratic republic, which I think is a more proper term to think about, I think that a lot of your evidence here is less about a warning about the malperformance in the long run of democratic republics than about the superiority of a mixed regime republic, which mixes, again, not only electorates, but time horizons, embeds them within the state. You could call it like the Republic of Time, or the Mixed Republic of Time. The superiority of that to a plebiscitary democracy. If that's the argument, I think I'm largely in agreement with you. But my sort of understanding from what I thought was actually your most powerful slide, which was the one on fluoridation, and truth be told, my grandfather was the health commissioner of Milwaukee for 40 years, lifelong Republican who got called a communist for fluoridating the city's water supply. But that to me actually suggests something useful about the fact that we actually have a political system that, despite its fault, embeds a longer-term horizon within the regime structure. And we've done it in different ways. I don't want to oversimplify, but it seems to me that, and maybe I'm just trying to improve my own mood, that is the takeaway that I'm grabbing from this, which is that yes, in the short run, the voters are going to make all these kinds of mistakes, particularly when you've got these short time horizons. Looking forward, the one-year mayors, and looking backwards, they're only doing retrospection for the last month or 3 months or things like that. But if you combine that with the fact that there are lots of different elections that go into policy, and those are aggregated over different staggered time horizons, and that statutes themselves have a life usually much longer than any of these, it strikes me that that might be cause for celebration, not of democracy as you're calling it, but for a mixed regime democratic republic.
Yeah, I guess there are two ways to think about this. One is with respect to the way ordinary people think about democracy. When I go to the 4th of July block party in Nashville, people aren't singing the praises of lifetime terms for Supreme Court justices and what a great thing it is that the health commissioner gets to be in power for 40 years. They're talking about the set of issues that we think are more likely to be problematic. From the point of view of scholarship, we have a political science that focuses not very much on questions like how long should terms actually be in order to produce the best results in terms of actual government, because we don't mostly think in that sense either. And so maybe part of what we're calling for is a political science of Republican democracy, if you want to use that term, rather than the current political science that we have, which seems to us to be greatly infected with these kind of simplistic ideas about what democracy is like or what it should be like.
I can put in a plug for historical approaches, but also look over the much longer term, 20, 30, 40, 50 periods of evaluation. That might also be experimental or quasi-experimental or not, quantitative or not, looking for much longer time horizons. Also consistent with your argument.
We're not sure we're in your league at doing that, but it's a helpful suggestion.
So there are several more questions here, so let me see how many we can fit in the little time we have left.
I was struck too by the fluoridation slide, and it seemed to me that in fact elites, office-seeking elites, are responding to the incentive structures that are put in place by the institutions governing their reelection. And so why is it not that we need to focus more on institutions? And in fact, there is a vibrant comparative politics literature that looks at the incentive structures created by electoral rules, for example, and how that generates incentives for more broadly redistributive policy, among other things. So why so quick to dismiss PR? PR electoral rules? What is it about groups and not rules or institutions that is more deserving of our attention? Of course, I'm a student of you guys. I'm on the same page.
Yeah, this is an irritating set of questions from people who know much more about the question they're asking than we do, but I'll let Larry answer this one too.
Yeah, know much more about the U.S. than other places and write much more about the U.S. than about other places, but I think our general impression is that things don't work fundamentally in different kinds of political systems, and in that respect, institutions probably aren't of first-order importance here. But one thing I want to say about the extent to which institutions provide leeway for elites to do what they want is that that's usually treated in an entirely negative way, right? So we may, to a greater or lesser extent, reduce the pressure of short-term public pressures on elite decision-making, but that leaves entirely open the question of whether elites, given that leeway, make good or bad decisions. And that's something, again, that I think political scientists have focused way too little on. Partly it's just hard to define, what's a good decision or what's a bad decision, but it also seems to have a lot to do with the details of political culture and a kind of study that has largely gone out of style in contemporary political science that would help us to understand why the elites in a particular time and place, given the opportunity, are going to push for one set of policies rather than another.
I have that we're out of time, but I'm going to try to squeeze one last question in and just steal from the time after. And with any luck, maybe we'll grab someone who's not one of Chris and Larry's students, maybe?
Thank you. Chris and Larry, I have two quick questions. One is that what you are talking about, that democracy is not mandate, it's like a zombie. And if the democracy, in the democracy, citizens are not informed. So are you suggesting that the democracy, especially in the United States, is pretty much elitism? That's the first question. The second question is that I can think of other examples where the elites in other countries that are very much pay attention to how the people think, especially when you have a very severe political cleavage in the society, like a single issue society, and so divisive, and the leaders will have to pay in order to gather the support. So they pay very much attention to the opinion of the constituency. In that kind of a situation, it's very much like a contradictory to what you, the finding you have here. So I'm wondering what what I'm driving is that in that situation, people even criticize it as a populist. The democracy pushed to the extreme like a populism. And the society becomes so divisive, and democracy becomes non-functioning. So whether you have any answer to that?
This is an even more scary question than the previous two. This is T.Y. Wong, my co-editor on another book, who has had to suffer from the times when I wasn't working on it because I was working with Larry. So I'm just happy that the question wasn't more hostile than it actually was. In the particular case of Taiwan, which is what I was thinking of as you spoke and may have been what you had in mind, I think we would argue that it's the cleavage that is crucial there and what politicians are paying attention to, and not really the details of the policy positions. That cleavage generates policy positions through the policy positions of the two principal political parties in Taiwan that represent that cleavage. But what's fundamental there is the gap between two very different notions of national identity for Taiwan, and it's that identity that's crucial, not policy positions per se.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that I think it's probably more likely that citizens, if they're worked up on more or less the same dimension, can force politicians to address a particular cleavage, but the details of how they address it are very much up in the air. So in the study that we did of the Depression, different kinds of governments with different ideological complexions all over the world dealt with it in rather different ways. In every case, if the economy improved, the citizens were fine with that, and if it didn't, they threw them out and tried somebody else until the economy improved. Economists still don't know much about a lot of the details of those policies and which ones actually helped and which ones hurt. But if you look, for example, at the US and Canada, the pattern of economic improvement was pretty similar, but seemed not to have much to do with who was pursuing what ideological agenda at any particular moment in time.
All right, so there are a number of other questions, but I think we're sort of well over our allotted time. The good news is that there's a manuscript and there'll be a book soon, and I have a feeling we'll be arguing about the argument for some time after that comes out. So for the moment, if you could join me in thanking Chris and Larry for their really interesting conversation.